Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. This is the third talk this semester in the Rethinking Public Religion series, funded by the Luce Foundation and put together by IRCPL in conjunction with Institute of African Studies and the South Asia Institute. This is the first of the talks we've had that focuses on Africa, so I'm very pleased to finally get to Africa. We've had two talks on South Asia, and of course this project is supposed to be bringing the two regions into dialogue, and for those of us attending the seminars over the course of the year to be able to reflect on similarities and differences in the various cases that we are considering. It's a pleasure to welcome Tom Boylston to Columbia. Tom is currently lecturer in social anthropology at Edinburgh University, so he's come quite a long way to be with us, and it's a real pleasure to have him here. Tom actually got his undergraduate degree at Oxford, nothing to do with anthropology or Ethiopia. He studied Chinese as an undergrad, and then made the radical shift. And I don't think it's reflected at all in your work, but I haven't seen any of that reflection. But in any case, after his undergrad degree at Oxford in 2004, he went to the London School of Economics, where he took his PhD in 2012. He then had a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship for 3 years, during which he did follow-on research in Ethiopia. His initial research in Ethiopia concerned Orthodox communities in the Zege Peninsula, and that resulted in a book that came out earlier this year with the University of California Press, called Stranger at the Feast. And what he looks at in the book is the various ways in which forms of prohibition within the church refract through social life. And he's also very interested in questions of media and mediation. And he has been a very important voice in debates within the anthropology of Christianity, looking at the connections between religion and media and how we can think about those two subjects. The talk that he's going to give us today is based on the research that he did not in the north of the country but in Addis. And the title is Religion as a Problem of Attention. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Boylston to Columbia.
Thank you for coming. It's really exciting to be here. As we start, since it's germane to the topic, I'd like to invite you to consider your own condition of attention right now. How are you feeling? You feeling alert, ready to go? Have you had food? Maybe like just the right amount, a little too much, feeling a bit sleepy? Have you had a coffee or other substances? Anything that will help you try and follow what I'm going to say for the next 50 minutes or so. If you're anything like me, you'll sort of drift off a bit 25 minutes in and then like snap back in a bit later and try and catch back up, and that's okay. So I'd like to start by suggesting that Ethiopian Orthodox Christians are intensely aware of these matters about the relationship between your body and your attentive state, particularly the relationship between what you've eaten or haven't eaten and your capacity to pay attention to the world. And this is why fasting is so important to everyday Ethiopian Orthodox life, as I've been writing about for the last few years. If you haven't fasted, a lot of Ethiopian Orthodox Christians would say, you are liable to experience desires for sex, desires for more food. You're liable to feel anger and passions. You're likely to quarrel and to desire self-fulfillment, which is distraction from God. If you have fasted, your flesh will be weakened and will not distract you from penitence, from the love of the Virgin Mary, and from acts of thanksgiving. So this is the starting point of my argument. For Ethiopian Orthodox Christians, sin is primarily understood as distraction, while fasting and other ascetic practices counteract this distraction and allow us to focus on spiritual pathways. The word attention itself, tikuret, can often have a kind of spiritual connotation, as thanks to my friend Teferi Abate up at Yale for a good discussion about this. Tikuret can be used in judging the regularity of someone's everyday practices, whether they're remembering, for example, to give thanks to God before eating. A second illustrative term for understanding attention is alama, your goal or your target. Spirituality for Orthodox Christians is largely, I would argue, about where your intentions lie. And when someone says alama onzate, he lost his goal, they can mean to have lost sight of one's spiritual direction. Religiosity in this sense is not so much about where you're at right now as where your focus is, where your attention is looking. So Ethiopian Orthodox Christians might agree with Oscar Wilde that we're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. So being spiritual is a matter of where your attention is directed. And for many Orthodox Christians, as for many Brits and Americans, the contemporary era is an age of distraction. So in contemporary Ethiopian Orthodox discourse, I feel fairly safe in generalizing, a major source of this distraction is construed as modernity, zemenawinit, and especially secularism. The second plank of my argument is that secularism is understood as any tradition of knowledge or any regime of attention that is non-ascetic. I'll try not to talk about aesthetics as well as ascetics, I'll just confuse myself. Here by ascetic, I mean not exactly renouncing the world, but ways of training the body and soul through periodic abstinence and seclusion. Asceticism is a relationship to time as much as to anything else. In fact, if you listen to German media theorists, ascetics invented modern ways of measuring time through the monastic counting of the hours. So in this talk, I'll explore how Ethiopian Orthodox Christians navigate the age of distraction, focusing especially on religious activists in Addis Ababa. For a good 15 years now, Addis has been undergoing a pretty major Orthodox Christian revival after a series of setbacks for the once dominant imperial religion. First, the socialist Derg government disempowered the church in the 1970s, executed some of the leaders and took the land. Then the emergence in the 1990s of the contemporary secular federal government, and with it a massive rise in Protestant conversion in what have been traditionally canonical Orthodox areas. And I'll suggest that the generally successful response of Orthodox activists has followed two tracks. One is to capture the attention of the faithful through hugely popular preaching movements, through broadcasting the liturgy over loudspeakers, through circulating religious material in digital formats, and as we'll see, through public exorcisms. Active Orthodox Christians are working to galvanize the faithful, to motivate them to stay with the church rather than to leave for Protestantism, and also to advance the political claim that Ethiopia is properly an Orthodox nation, against the reality that more than half of the country is not actually Orthodox Christian. So the first part of this religious work then is capturing attention through media, through public discourse and display. But this kind of spectacular work is often morally problematic. It runs against religious principles of humility. It often turns into quarreling and aggression between groups. And the second part of contemporary religious activism is not to capture attention, but to turn that attention into some other kind of spiritual activity. This is happening through quite a radical attempt to transform the way religious education happens in Christian Ethiopia. In particular, we're seeing the construction of a network of extracurricular church education throughout pretty much all of Ethiopia's universities, and the mobilization of various lay organizations to raise funds for rehabilitation of monasteries and traditional church schools in the Ethiopian countryside. And I think this education reform can be understood as a highly politicized attempt to create particular kinds of attentive subjects who are versed both in ascetic disciplines and with the technical components of secular education as prescribed in the government curriculum. So spectacular public religious work goes alongside this deeper network of influence that's being built through these regimes and techniques of building attentive people. So I've slightly misspoken in calling this talk Religion as a Problem of Attention. I actually mean religion as two problems of attention. One problem is how to attend to the divine, particularly in Abrahamic traditions where divinity is understood as distant, not necessarily immediately available, or perhaps not distant, but not immediately available to the senses. The second being how to spread the message, how to keep the faithful on track with the religion, being active. And we can see aspects of this dual problem throughout the recent literature on religion of media, thinking of people like Tanya Lerman, Charles Hirschkin, Brian Larkin, Navida Khan, Webb Keen, Birgit Meyer, so forth. Much of this literature hinging on how, especially in the Abrahamic ontologies, non-corporeal divine messages become available to the senses through sensational and semiotic forms and through aesthetic disciplines and practices. And I'm writing very much from within the influence of this tradition. But what I'd hope this paper can offer is first a sense of how Ethiopian Orthodox Christians themselves understand these questions of matter and spirit and communication. And second, to suggest that a more fleshed out discussion of attention, and especially ecologies of attention, which I'll introduce in a second, would be very valuable for thinking through some of this material. And I don't claim at all that previous scholars have ignored attention. All of the people I've mentioned touch on it in some ways. Some studies like Hirschkin's Ethical Soundscape can be read through and through as studies of attention. Some of the scholars who've looked most closely at attention and religion have tended to focus on prayer. Thinking of David Marner's Death Be Not Proud, which reads John Donne's religious poetry as a meditation on distraction, and the attempt to cultivate what he calls holy attention, which is, among other things, the capacity to attend to one's own mortality clearly and without looking away. Tanya Lerman has shown the kinds of training required by evangelical Christians to learn to attend to God. Like Marno, she draws on St. Augustine's reflections on the difficulties of attention in prayer. And for Augustine, the problem in his prayer was that of temporal beings trying to contemplate the eternal. As it's sometimes said, for Augustine, our minds and souls are stretched across time. He said, "In you, O my mind, I measure times. Do not overwhelm me with your clamour. That is, do not overwhelm yourself with the multitude of your impressions." Later on in the same section, "But I have been divided amid times, the order of which I know not, and my thoughts, even the inmost bowels of my soul, are mangled with tumultuous varieties, until I flow together into you, purged and molten in the fire of your love." So only through unification with God can we lose this sense of the distended soul that's stretched across time and hence distracted by thoughts of past, present, and future. So attention, in short, for Augustine is fleeting. It's prone to get caught up in memories of the past and projections of the future, in what has been called the distension of the soul. This is what it means to be caught up in temporal things, to be unable to focus on eternity. And both Marno and Lerman describe how people may, through the cultivation of certain forms of attentiveness, hope to overcome this condition of distraction by training yourself to become neither active nor exactly passive, but in a state of general receptive readiness to hear God speak to you, to become attentive towards God. But in preparing this talk, I've also been inspired by a growing literature on capitalist economies of attention. Beginning with Jonathan Crary's studies of distraction in Western art, through Cathy Davidson's arguments about changing attention regimes in education, and especially to the French literature scholar Yves Sitton and his recent work on the ecology of attention. These works trace what we might call regimes of attention, how social modes of attentiveness and distraction are historically and politically shaped, especially by capital, by technology, and by consumer culture. And the literature on attention gives us some basic premises that I'll be bearing in mind in the talk. Firstly, attention is joint. We learn to attend to things by following the attention of others. Attention is thus a key mechanism for any kind of sociality to be possible, and something anthropologists, I think, in general should be more attentive to. We pay attention to the way others pay attention. We follow the gaze of others to try and pick out what is salient in our social environment. And this is how we learn to perceive things together. Following on from this, and because it is joint attention is subject to historical regimes and historical formation. Here, thinking about your own attentive state, I'd ask you to recall your own experiences in the schoolroom, how you learned to sit straight, to listen to the teacher, to take in information without talking to your neighbour, to hold that position for the length of a class and beyond. And how this training occurred at the group level, how it happens to whole classrooms full of kids in a British or American society. I'd also invite you to think, as you probably already do, of how your relationship to your smartphone or your tablet has changed your bodily, physical relationship to your own attention span, and hence to your environment, and how that's happened also to other people you know at the same time. Because attention describes a relationship between the self, the world, and other selves. It is potentially a non-dualistic concept. It's not making a hard divide between body and the world, or between matter and spirit. Certainly in the hands of theorists like Tim Ingold or Thomas Chodesh, who have long argued that religion has more to do with embodied attentiveness to an environment than with propositional content per se. So attention describes our relationship to material spiritual worlds. Number 4, attention is a value. By looking at things, I confer value on them, I make them more interesting and more valuable to others. But also something that is converted into other values. This will be really important for this talk. Think about how Google, YouTube, or Facebook are challenged to turn page rankings and page views into some kind of revenue stream, the kind of work that involves in turning those numbers into something that you can actually trade and exchange. And 5, related to this, attention is qualitatively variable, and this is one of Yves Sitton's key contributions. He pushes back against the idea of an attention economy by showing how efforts to standardize and quantify attention in the form of page views and things must be resisted. They make of a very variable experience of the world a pure measurable number, whereas an ecology of an attention accepts the variability, the way that attention moves in and out of focus, that it may change over time and be shaped, take on different forms. Particularly important for thinking about the qualities of religious attention and the disciplines by which we try and shape them. And attention, as we've seen, also varies over time. For Augustine, attention was quite simply the experience of temporality. Attention describes not just our ability to perceive something, but to fix on it, to try and stay with it over time. And attention in Sitton's terms is ecological. It exists in a complex system of relations. And I'm interested in bringing this discussion to bear in a place like Ethiopia, where religion retains a massive place in the shared attention ecology, and where the portion of public attention taken up by consumer advertising, for example, is comparatively uneven, comparatively small. And I think attention draws us in slightly different directions from concepts of public religion. Michael Warner, for example, has argued that publics are created by mere attention. They're constituted in mere attention. But this is not at all about mere attention. It's about the techniques and the institutions required to build longer-term disciplinary regimes of attention. It's about the way we try to deepen or elongate our attention. And it's about the temporal and the metaphysical challenges that surround religious attentiveness in particular. And this leads me to what's been the most striking phenomenon doing fieldwork in Addis Ababa through to 2015. The sheer number of young people who are combining religious and secular education, often doing one by day and the other by night. This is particularly new because these educational traditions are distinct not only in their histories. There's the traditional church education system that was the major or only way of educating people in northern Ethiopia. The other introduced in the 20th century based mainly on European principles. But the two schools of education also have substantially different regimes of attention. In traditional church education, you begin with memorization and with fasting. And only through asceticism and rote learning can you begin to absorb divine knowledge. So asceticism is not separable from the process of acquiring religious knowledge. Secular modern style schooling, the government curriculum, does have its own disciplinary bodily techniques, sitting quietly, listening to the teacher, writing essays in silence. But these are understood to be purely pragmatic. They efficiently serve the purpose of transferring information, rather than having some broader ethical or spiritual rationale to them. So we might call these regimes of attention the ascetic and the technical. And one question that preoccupies young Orthodox activists is how you can have both: the technical skills of government education, the ascetic skills of the religious. This is a religious school in northern Ethiopia. So the traditional knowledge systems of the Orthodox Church, I would argue, are built around fighting distraction. Traditional education is monastic. Students would travel to remote monasteries or remote church centres, preferably on mountaintops or in forests, where from the age of 6 or 7 years old, they would begin to learn Ge'ez, the classical language of the Orthodox liturgy. They do so by learning to sound out, syllable by syllable, the epistles of John or the Psalms of David, until they had memorized them and could move on to the next text. Their asceticism was part of the learning process, so through fasting, hard work, and importantly, separation from their families, students begin to become able to absorb divine knowledge stored within the broad Ethiopian canon. In this tradition, there's no creativity without fasting. You can't begin to compose poetry or to create knowledge until you've imbibed the tradition, but also the ascetic practices that allow you to become a channel for the Holy Spirit, which is the actual source of creativity. Eventually, students might go on to become monks, but they might also move back into the community as priests or as religious scholars. So the ascetic tradition feeds back into the world. It doesn't seek a permanent separation. And this education system has become tremendously important for lay Orthodox activists in the city today. This is partly because the traditional education system represents the continuity of the church. It ensures the future supply of priests. But it also stands, I think, for a form of religious attentiveness that is felt critically to define what Ethiopian Orthodoxy is. The system of church education is felt to be under threat as rural families feel the need to send their children to secular government schools in order to have any kind of future. For activists who say that secularism is a corrosive force that makes all forms of knowledge equivalent, it's tremendously important to have a knowledge system that stands at a remove from the world. As a result, urban activists put a great deal of time and also a great deal of money into providing material support for church schools and church students. And this involves collecting and moving large amounts of resources, large amounts of money across the country. And when talking about the two traditions of education, pretty much all the young people I've talked to regard the church tradition much more highly than secular education. They point out how most of the great thinkers and writers in Amharic have come from the church tradition. They point to its rigor, its wisdom, its ethical qualities, and so forth. But young activists also, without exception, acknowledge the importance and the necessity of secular education techniques. They acknowledge that secular education is powerful and desirable for themselves and for others to have any prospects in the contemporary world, and to counteract the growth of Protestantism, which makes widespread use of secular education techniques. For especially middle-class Orthodox activist Ethiopians, the pressing question is how to synthesize or combine these two streams of education into something that might reinforce orthodoxy without secularizing or reforming it. It's very important to avoid reformation. Like any kind of renewal becomes interpreted as stealth attempts to reform the church, often from within. So one way to think of this question is how to turn worldly techniques to spiritual ends. So most Orthodox Ethiopians talk about the spiritual and the worldly quite a lot, the Memphisawi and the Alamawi. And I would argue that they tend to understand the relationship between worldly and spiritual things in terms of attention. And one Orthodox activist told me, look, no Christian can be totally separate from the world. The challenge is how to live in it. That is spirituality. We are created with flesh. What matters is your ideology or your intention, where your work is going. I think an ideology here would be ra'ayot alam, your vision of the world, a vision in the religious sense. And what concerns many activists is how to build spiritual attention into worldly work or secular work to ensure that one's view of the world is properly spiritual. And this involves attending to one's body as well as attending to the world. That's where fasting comes in, because all Ethiopian Orthodox Christians fast, usually not to extremes, but regularly enough to build the habit of fasting into your everyday life. So most of your life is experienced in terms of whether you're fasting or not. And especially in the city, they tend to describe fasting as a weakening of the flesh and therefore a weakening of the passions of lust or anger or pride. It's only when these passions are dimmed that we'll be able to be penitent and to attend to our sins and to attend to Mary and the saints who will intercede with us with God and to help us remember that we are creations of God and subject to Him. So I think it's important that distraction is understood to originate from both within and outside the body. So lust is a desire for other people, but it's something felt through one's body. Similarly with anger, it's aroused by things in the world, by other people, but it's something you feel through your own flesh. So sin and distraction come from a relationship between the body and the world. They do not simply arise from within you. Only by disciplining the body can we reconfigure our relationship to the world to be a spiritual one in which our proper spiritual goals remain clear to us, and in particular when we're conscious of our total dependence on God. So there's some debate about whether Ethiopian Orthodox Christians are dualistic, and I think this is very much not a dualism of matter and spirit, despite the fact that worldliness and spirituality are constantly evoked. It's an understanding of attention as a relationship between the body and that which is outside it. So being attentive in this context also means showing humility. Because we're sinful beings, you can't really be attentive without also becoming very penitent. The opposite of this is to be prideful and therefore to seek attention to oneself, and this becomes a key indicator of the differences between Orthodox Christians and Protestants. One young theological scholar told me, the problem with Protestant hymns is they say things like, "Every day I praise you." This is terrible. This is problematic because it's seen as bragging about your piety. He said, "Ma kabad," to make yourself seem like a big deal. And hence making things about you rather than God. But also it addresses God directly, where a proper Orthodox Christian should approach God humbly with penitence and preferably through a mediator, such as a saint or the Virgin Mary. Protestants also tend to use modern instruments or musical synthesizers in their hymns, and in response there have been Orthodox campaigns to restrict religious music to traditional instruments only. These include mainly the harp and the drum. These instruments are associated with King David and with Saint Yared, who was a 6th century composer of religious music and author of most of the music of the Ethiopian religious tradition, the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. So, Orthodox activists have very frequently told me that Protestant music is worldly. In part, this comes from a general view that ancient things are spiritual and modern things are worldly. But I think there's more to it than that. Orthodox hymns and instruments are explicitly built around a temporal cycle that moves between penitence and festivity. At times of fasting and penitence, you never play the drums. At times of celebration, you bring the drums out. You play a faster pace of music. So the traditional music is a particular kind of affective or emotional technology that's meant to shape your emotions and your attention in certain ways. So to cause you to flow between penitent attention to your sins and joyous thanksgiving. And in using modern instruments, Protestant music is understood to flatten out these effective, attentive techniques, and so to leave no room for penitential reflection. And this flattening effect describes, I think, very closely what Orthodox activists describe as secularization, the destruction of ascetic regimes of attention. And this helps me understand why, in the eyes of Orthodox activists, Protestants and secularists are the same thing. There is no distinction between them. Give it a second to recalibrate your attention. Right, so there's a large neo-traditionalist Orthodox revival going on in Addis and across the country, as has been discussed recently by Meron Zeleke. This is, among other things, a response to the secularization of the state, the disempowering of the church over the socialist area, and the rise of Protestantism in classically Orthodox areas. But there were concerns about the rise of Protestantism even before the socialists came along in 1974. There was a 1965 Council of the Oriental Orthodox Churches in Addis Ababa, which, according to activists I spoke to, was a moment where the churches collectively decided to, as he put it, turn towards the world. This meant, in particular, activating the laity in the service of the church, rather than saying the church will get on with church things, the laity would do whatever, and they wouldn't have much to do with each other outside of general service. So this saw in Ethiopia the foundation of the Sunday school movement, which has been very widespread, highly successful effort to broaden the religious knowledge and religious engagement of the laity. It's been particularly important in activating women in service of the church, because women weren't exactly excluded from traditional church education, but it wasn't the norm to send girls off to work. It wasn't considered part of a general trajectory, and women couldn't be and can't be priests. But revival today is not being driven by the Orthodox Church hierarchy itself. And indeed it really can't be, for a number of reasons. The core hierarchy of the church, the Patriarchate and the Synod, is a very, very slow-moving institution. It's not supposed to rapidly respond to social events. It's not supposed to change all that much. So you need a much more flexible and less sacred kind of organization that can act on behalf of the church if you really want to enact social, religious change. And the main source of activism is through a kind of quasi-autonomous society called a mahaber, an informal church lay organization. Mahaber just means an association. So a mahaber, it's quite a long-standing kind of institution. It was traditionally a local voluntary association where a bunch of important local political people would get together with a priest. The priest would bless the meeting in the name of the saint. They'd have a meeting together. They'd have a meal together. And then discuss matters of shared political interest. At least this is how it's worked in rural areas in northern Ethiopia. It was a way for prominent lay citizens to organize political affairs with the blessing of the church and with some kind of echo of the Last Supper, but without actually being subject to command from the church hierarchy. So there's a large degree of autonomous action there. And today, according to a senior church figure I spoke to, there are about 14,000 active mahabers in Addis Ababa today. And these range from a handful of members formed to carry out a specific project to well-organized corporate structures with thousands of members. And mahabers today tend to work in the service of the church, most commonly by raising funds, especially for the rehabilitation of churches and monasteries in the countryside. Several mahaber members have described to me the need to shore up the Orthodox presence in the countryside by rebuilding churches. They describe rural areas as free from the corruption of the city, where people are very strong in faith, but also ignorant and lacking in resources, vulnerable to nefarious activities by Muslim or Protestant invaders. So the countryside is a place where true orthodoxy can thrive, but a place that's construed as constantly being under threat as well. And they're also recalling here some of the monastic tradition of the Desert Fathers, that true religion happens in remote places. And a key part of this work is mahaber members go on pilgrimages, Menfasawi Guzo, a spiritual journey, to rural church sites to witness for themselves the work that needs to be done. And some of this work's happening in areas where there's never been a particularly strong Orthodox presence, suggesting that in the west and south of the country, many mahabers are not just rehabilitating the church in traditional Orthodox areas, but actively working to expand the influence of the religion into new territory within Ethiopia. And the pilgrimage is a key example of how attention turns into revenue streams. All of the major mahaber donors and organizers I've spoken to began their fundraising work with a spiritual journey. Through organizing spiritual journeys, activists draw the attention of the urban faithful to the plight of the rural churches, and that attention leads to donations towards projects of rural restoration. So pilgrimages are important awareness-raising events for fundraising purposes. But by far the largest mahabar in Ethiopia today, the most influential and the most controversial, is the Mahabar Addis Ababa, the Association of All Saints. And its foundation is pretty interesting. This was towards the tail end of the socialist Derg era in the late 1980s. The government sent a whole load of students off to the countryside to undergo military training, to try and create a reserve force. And some of these students had been part of groups that were attempting to preserve the teachings of the Church Fathers through the socialist era. But the military camp brought larger numbers of like-minded students together, and I've talked to some of them about this experience. There they formed the Mahabar Addis Ababa, and this is how its reason for being is currently described on their website. To keep the youth in higher institutions who baptized and become children of the Holy Spirit from heretics who use various means to trap and to deviate their belief. Heretics is often code for Protestants, but sometimes the reformers within as well. They meant socialists as well. To design favourable means for students of higher institutions to know and preserve, as well as pass on to the next generation the canon and tradition of the church passed on to them by the forefathers of the church, and to enable the youth to overcome the social problems upon graduation and in serving their country and the church with their profession, to follow up the youth's adherence and practice of the Orthodox belief. So, a group to mobilize the educated part of lay society, focused especially around higher education. And to use all available means to increase evangelism as well. And the Mahabar Addis Ababa has been hugely successful in fundraising. They now have a 7-story building in the middle of Addis that they run their operations from. They have quite a large media department. But perhaps the most striking success has been the establishment of campus congregations, the Gibi Gubai, in pretty much every university in Ethiopia. These are groups of educational groups of people who are taking psychology and engineering degrees and things, but doing religious study on the side. So the Mahabar Addis Ababa runs courses for students at secular university to go alongside their regular studies. These courses cover canon law, doctrine, dogma, liturgy, Bible study, but the broad Orthodox canon, not the narrow Protestant focus on the Bible alone. And according to the Secretary General of the Mahabar Addis Ababa, as of 2015, 300,000 students had passed through the Mahabar Addis Ababa, had graduated from Mahabar Addis Ababa courses. So the Mahabar Addis Ababa has created a class of university graduates who are also well-informed, highly energetic religious activists. As the Secretary General told me, if you were to visit Gondar University in the north of the country, you would think it was a theological college, he said. So strong is the Mahabar Addis Ababa presence there. A second plank of Mahabar Addis Ababa activity is support for the rural church schools, as we've been discussing. And that's largely what all these graduates are out raising funds for. So the Secretary General, who I interviewed, himself was a geologist who's taking a furlough from geological work to lead the organization, and told me this common story that farmers today don't provide material support for church students as they used to. And parents want their children to have benefits of modern education, so the Mahabar Addis Ababa, he explained to me, looks for ways to give children both secular and church education, and then funnels large amounts of money into support in providing basic sustenance for children at the church schools. So the Mahabar Addis Ababa uses modern education, its engineers, its doctors, its accountants, to support traditional education in the rural areas, to ensure the future supply of priests, but also to try and secure the countryside for orthodoxy in a political sense. And that use of technology and modern institutions to prop up a notion of a pure and sullied tradition is perhaps not unfamiliar from other neo-traditionalist religious movements. But it's important to remember that a lot of this money is going towards the training of ascetic people, memorizers and reciters of texts, practitioners of fasting, and those who learn through rigorous study and prayer in solitude. What's quite new is that a lot of students are doing this work at night while attending secular school in the daytime. So the university students are getting religious education that they're doing outside of their classes, and the church students are getting secular education that they're doing in the day to support them in their traditional religious work. And it's tremendously hard work. It's really burning the candle at both ends. You're working through the day and the night, but there is a generation of young Orthodox Christians who are doing it. And the Mabruk Edison has also gone as far as to build schools in Addis Ababa that teach the government curriculum, but also teach liturgical Ge'ez language, but they now use modern kind of grammatical methods rather than the rote memorization. So they're sort of shifting the techniques by which you teach religious practices. So if I'm arguing that secular and traditional schooling operate by significantly different regimes of attention, it's important to understand that people are trying to work out how to combine these regimes rather than to keep them separate. But as I was leading up to in the opening of the talk, the flip side of this educational work is the Mabruk Edison's publicity work and evangelism. They have a substantial media wing, they have a publishing press, they have a newspaper and a magazine, they have an academic journal, they have TV and radio shows that are broadcast on EBS, which is mostly watched by the diaspora, but it is available within the country if you have satellite. And much of this work simply involves things like biographies of important church fathers, discussions of church business. But a large part of the Mabruk Edison's public material is engaged in the battle against reformism. So it's public criticisms and denouncements, both of Protestants, but also of Orthodox priests who are suspected of harbouring reformist intentions. And parts of southern Ethiopia, Mabruk Edison members have been accused of inciting violence against Protestants and sometimes against Muslims. And throughout work in Addis Ababa, many Orthodox Christians would express concerns or suspicions that the Mabruk Edison was engaged in personal vendettas and witch hunts in the name of anti-reformism. And there's a lively debate in Ethiopian scholarship about whether media has exacerbated interreligious tensions. In the Mabruk Edison's case, it seems fairly clear that it has, or at least that people really feel that it has. But I'd argue that there's always a problem in Orthodox thought with the use of media to capture attention and seek influence. While many Orthodox Christians have told me there's nothing wrong with media per se, they also express concerns with the frequency with which media discourse turns into fighting and attention seeking, two inherently anti-spiritual activities. But this media work's also acknowledged to be necessary for the promotion of the organization's educational activities. So, within the framework of an ecology of attention, we might think of this as the conversion of short-term attention capture into more durable attentive forms. So rather than just converting attention into money, you're converting into other longer-standing regimes of attention. In the work to provide church education to university students, the Mabruk Edison is consciously trying to shape people who are attentive to the church during their non-religious professional careers. And they emphasize especially people who will be government workers. It's very important for them to have spiritual attentiveness, despite the clear secularity of the government. So yeah, explicitly the idea is for engineers, government workers, public service servants to have this attentive regime as part of their lives, to be thinking of the needs of the church and to be thinking religiously. And also to be attending to the needs of the church, particularly in its rural conditions, the state of the church in the countryside as the thing that feeds the life of the church everywhere. And hence to orthodoxy's claims to political or to hegemony across Ethiopian territory. So public modes of capturing attention, for example through preaching or magazines or TV shows, need to convert that attention into something. Flows of revenue, but also particular kinds of attentive people. Young professionals who are attentive to the church scholars schooled in traditional ascetic modes of attention and knowledge, and all of these people also equipped with the tools of attention that the government secular curriculum provides. This is a national scale effort to produce people with both technical and ascetic skills. How did it go?
Yeah. A couple more minutes. 10 minutes.
It'll be 10 more minutes back. So I want to really quickly, just to highlight some of the problems that public attention brings, talk about exorcism. There's been these very popular, very widely watched public exorcisms happening in the middle of Addis Ababa. This is Mamrugurma Wandamu performing an exorcism, and he calls people on stage who've been possessed by demons, commands the demon to speak through the voice of the person. The demon tells the crowd all the terrible things it's made the person do. And then the monk exorcises them on the stage, the person gives thanks to the saints. This is all filmed by Memorgoma and his associates, and it's then circulated on VCD, it's put on YouTube, it's circulated to the diaspora. It's really quite a lot like the Jerry Springer show, in that these sort of small personal dramas become performed and reinterpreted as kind of with strong moral overtones. And there's also a huge audience present. So this happens within a churchyard in the center of Addis. You get an audience of over 1,000 people for each one of these exorcisms. It happens every Sunday. Some of these people are possessed, looking for help, large numbers of possessed people. Some come driven by faith to witness God's miracles. Some are highly skeptical and think Memorgoma is either a charlatan or a sorcerer. Many are unsure but simply think it's fascinating and fun and really entertaining and kind of better than anything else is going on. But it's very much performed for this audience. And only recently the world champion distance runner Gate Ewami was exorcised on video and claimed that her running career had been held back by various people possessing her. And then Haile Gebrselassie, the great hero of distance running, came out and said, this is nonsense, this guy's a charlatan. There's a massive debate going on right now. And Memorgoma's narrative is always the same. He interprets the suffering people have been given by these demons in terms of Ethiopia is the last bastion of true religion, but it's besieged on all sides by devils of secularism and Protestantism. And what's happening to these people is the secular demon is giving them too many desires. He makes fun of their modern clothing, he makes fun of their consumer habits. And the problems that people come to Memorgoma with are generally quite similar issues of debt problems, money problems, anxieties over educational achievement and status aspiration and things. And these are reinterpreted, and people describe frequently chinket. It's stress, it's having too many thoughts. And these are reinterpreted in the terms of demonic possession and then cathartically cured. And it's hugely controversial, partly because it makes a lot of money. Like, this is a very effective way of turning attention into revenue streams, some of which go to the church, but Memorgoma was also arrested in 2015 for corruption, having allegedly been given a house by one of the people he cured, and was then released a few weeks later. But there's this constant suspicion, both that he's sort of taking the money, but also that he's drawing attention away from the church. This happens in the churchyard, but the church has started making the liturgy go on longer and longer, so it'll overlap with the exorcism. So Memorgoma is exercising on his microphone in the churchyard. The liturgy is amplified through megaphones from within the church, and they're sort of cacophonizing over each other. So there's this tension about he's bringing value into the church, but also risking taking attention away from the church itself and becoming very suspect in its own right. He also tours the diaspora and does fundraising for Orthodox churches in Italy and in Britain and places. So, to conclude. But the other thing to remember about Memorgoma is, once someone has been through possession, they tend to keep coming back. They will always be at risk of being repossessed. It's a bit like drug and alcohol recovery. And I've spoken to former possessed people who say, look, it's only through coming back, through witnessing other people go through the process, through getting the holy water, that you can truly take on the lessons that you learned. Like the reasons that you were possessed, to do with your desires, your orientation to the world, can get fixed. So as well as turning attention into revenue streams, Memorgoma is turning attention into longer-term attentive regimes and attentive disciplines. So, we've looked at the organizations who are training university students and professional people to become religious activists in their own rights, agreeing that the country needs engineers and geologists, working to make sure these professionals are also spiritually attentive people. And we've looked at public exorcisms in which common anxieties around consumption, achievement, and debt are revealed to be the result of foreign and demonic invasion. And for critics of Memorgoma, these exorcisms, even as they claim to bring people back to the church, actually become distractions in their own right. They're worldly spectacles rather than spiritual disciplines. And they're worldly because they are distracting. So thinking comparatively, the anthropologist Jo Cook has recently begun publishing her work on mindfulness culture in the UK. And she argues that we need to pay attention to attention because mindfulness practices focus on embodied disciplinary techniques that have emerged to counteract the experience of time in contemporary media capitalism, an experience of time that's largely driven by a movement between a series of instants. And mindfulness techniques are felt to be necessary to develop a longer-term bodily focus, a longer-term sense of relatedness between body and world and others. So the literature on attention capitalism shows us that concerns over distraction are substantially older than the smartphone age, probably go back as far as advertising or the Industrial Revolution. Thinking through my Ethiopian ethnography in this context has drawn attention to a couple of things. Partly that religious repertoires contain their own regimes of attention, and also that these attentive regimes coexist with other regimes born out of schooling or media capitalism, or perhaps regimes of labor. So I'd like to argue that it's not that there's a distinctive religious regime of attention, but there are several regimes of attention: the aesthetic, the technical, one might add the ritual, the regimes that come through labor. And religion may draw upon these different attentive regimes in an attempt to convert attention into longer-term forms of value built around this old Augustinian question of how to attend to God, how to attend to the world in a spiritual fashion. And remembering, following Augustine, that these are always also ways of organizing the subjective experience of time. So the task I'm interested in trying to develop through this talk is how these techniques of time and attention coexist with, or alter or oppose those of techno-capital or the secular state. I'll conclude there. Thanks for your attention.
Tom, thank you so much for that. Very rich presentation that raises a lot of issues. I will turn to questions in a moment, but as people gather their thoughts, why don't I pose a question or two to you. I would be interested to hear a bit more about these kind of historical aspects that you referenced right at the end with concern. I mean, on the one hand, you're tying it to a very long-standing tradition within Christian thought to Augustine, and that value of attention. But you're also locating a certain kind of anxiety around attention to the emergence of the market and capitalist economies as they link up with mass media, advertising, etc. And I'd like to ask a bit more about maybe how this, if you can add a bit of or reflect on the ways in which this has played out in Ethiopia. Can you say a bit more about the extent to which, in a place like Addis, especially given the political history of the 20th century, something more about the particularities of market economies, of advertising, the prominence or lack thereof of advertising, or of a public culture in which there are different actors or institutions or corporations, both in the kind of economic sense, but also the more generic sense, bodies, which are vying for someone's attention on the street. So I think it might be helpful to hear a bit more about that. And then another question is just what, and this is a more kind of phenomenological question, but the people that you were talking to, you in a sense, you've told us a lot about attention, But in a sense, I'm not yet sure how would the people that you were working with describe a proper state of attention? What is it that marks, the moment of being attentive? And I'm thinking about this because you raised the work of Tanya Lerman among many others, who talks about something else related, but absorption. I mean, she's very interested in this idea of absorption and being kind of gripped or absorbed by this sense of connection, in this case to God. I mean, it wouldn't be that with the Orthodox, since that's too direct. But nevertheless, I would be interested to hear a bit more about how the people you were working with talk about it, or maybe don't, and how you kind of dealt with that as an ethnographer. So.
Thanks. I'll start with that one because I can think of an answer right now. As you might expect, I think for the activists I was talking about, the proper state of attention starts with fasting. And think of particular cases, fasting and taking the Eucharist as well is described as a relief from other emotions. It's being relieved of certain kinds of desires or certain kinds of sort of distracting tendencies. So it's a sort of calmness rather than absorption, particularly for thinking of a trainee priest who really described how difficult it was to sort of stay celibate before marriage and to work through the priesthood. And described both fasting and the Eucharist as just lifting all this stuff from it. So being able to not worry about that stuff, therefore. Yeah. And once you're lifted of that stuff, you're able to remember, particularly the Virgin Mary, or whichever saint you're focused on. And I think that's pretty widespread. That once those other, through fasting especially, once those other distractions are lifted from you, you become more conscious, more able to give thanksgiving, more able to think of and remember Mary. But I think people describe it as somewhat joyous, like a transformation of suffering into a sort of joyous feeling but being released rather than absorbed, being calm, not quarrelling is a really important thing. Like not being sort of passionately aroused. I think is, like, I can think of numerous cases where that's been described as an ideal form of attention. With regards to the general sort of attention landscape of the public sphere, that's useful because the sort of state projects are very important in the public sphere, very important in advertising, particularly noticeable after the death of the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. There was a great deal of lots of posters, lots of advertising that sort of drew on religious imagery to memorialize him and his developmental project for Ethiopia. So that's an important part of the public sphere. Commercial advertising is present, not enormous, but the presence of commodities and things to buy is very much part of an attention economy, and that, or an attention ecology, and that's what I like about it. That it doesn't have to be specifically media techniques. It's just what's sort of present in your surroundings. But to describe an attention ecology well, you'd also talk about low private television ownership, high smartphone usage, high usage of public transport in which spaces are used especially for religious messages, high amounts of people using religious imagery and iconography on their smartphones as reminders and ways to be constantly sort of brought back, even through their media technology, brought back to a kind of reflective Thanksgiving state. So that's the start of an answer. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Richard Forbes, Society of St. Hatata, but not to ambush you. That's me taking communion from the patriarch of Ethiopian Orthodox Church.
Oh, magnificent. When was that?
2 years ago. That was in D.C. Secondly, you teach here, you know Professor Abbey Ford from Ethiopia?
I know.
The dean? That's my family.
Wonderful.
His brother's an archaeologist also.
Ah, brilliant.
This picture here is me with the dean of the seminary school in Ethiopia. I've known him since he was 19 years old. He had a little problem with your title. I'm glad you changed it, because I only spoke to him 2 days ago. As far as attention, Psalm 63, which we are required to say every morning, "Oh my God, early will I seek thee." also in that song, when I meditate on the night watches, because that'll be my help. So there's your attention.
Mm-hmm.
I will privately send you some things that you left out because you left total is equal to the sum of all the parts. You a little lacking in the whole total. You didn't mention, you mentioned priests, they're Kes. Professor Abby Ford's mother is the highest awarded woman in Ethiopia for schooling. Ling Young Ford. So you work in Ethiopia and you never heard of her?
No.
The highest awarded woman in Ethiopia, Ming Young Ford. But privately, because other people want to talk, but I will give it to you later.
Thank you.
Well, wonderful. Yes. Yeah. The gentleman here.
I just had a wonderful presentation. I have just a question, two, you'd be so generous. First, I'm interested in, if you could elaborate a bit, because I was wondering this as you brought it up, about Mahibra Kurdistan, and their criticism of this reformism, not only Reform Christianity, Protestant Christianity, but reformism within the church.
Yeah.
And first, I was wondering if you could explain what exactly this reformism entails, and secondly, if this response includes on their part, for instance, encouraging a more conservative, a more comprehensive following of, say, Muslim fasting. And I know that in Ethiopia, a lot of people have gone back where they fast only, say, once a week, and now fast multiple times a week and multiple times a year, and I think the traditional calendar holds that you fast more days than you used to not fasting. So what role they played in that? And secondly, I'm curious I'm very interested that you mentioned that they feel that they are, I think this was that Ethiopia is the last bastion of true religion. And this is interesting to hear because this so closely mirrors traditional Western accounts of Ethiopia as a sort of island of Christianity in Islamic, in the Muslim Sea. And I guess, first of all, is that draws from Western narratives, or is it fully indigenous? And second of all, is there a certain nationalistic element in the defense of the religion, that this is our indigenous religion, this is a religion we have kept for thousands of years, before the Westerners who are spreading Protestantism even follow the religion themselves? Is there a nationalist element in this?
Yeah.
So that's my points.
So I'll try and work backwards. Thank you. These are fantastic questions. The answer to most of them is yes. So is there a nationalist element? Very much so. And there's a particular history that you can get through the Church Museum that's promoted by various aspects within the Orthodox Church. That goes back to Queen of Sheba, the story of Solomon, the transfer of the Ark. So Christianity, as Ethiopia is the elect of Christianity 1,000 years before there was Christianity. And that narrative is something that you will very much hear talking with religious activists in particular. And clearly there's no room in that narrative for Muslim Ethiopians or for groups in the Southern Nations Nationalities region. So there's de facto a sort of somewhat nostalgic kind of religious nationalism. I think that's strongest with the Mahibra Kurdistan. And as you suggest, I think they are the most traditionalist of the sort of publicly speaking bodies. They're the hardest in the reversion to traditional instruments only. And also pushing like much more fasting and pushing for more celibacy until marriage, so you can have a full communion marriage with the crown and everything else. They've been quite successful in encouraging a return of some of those practices, which have always been present but variable in Orthodox communities. Forgive me, can you remind me of the other questions?
The first part was about what exactly is the nature of this reformism which they are so opposed to?
It seems to be debated. The word is tahadaso, which means
yes.
reformist, as opposed to tawado, the unified. Some people will tell me that it's something of a spectre. It's been conjured up as the enemy within, but some people will deny that there are actually Tadeso monks or Tadeso priests working within Orthodox communities. Others will point to specifically named priests who have splintered off from the church and formed independent small churches.
There is an Addis church.
Yeah.
It is quite small.
There are empirically some people who've done it. The people I've spoken to who deny that there are more Tadeso deny that there are other people within the church working towards its reform or destruction. They claim that it has been trumped up for political purposes or to create an enemy. In that the particular conversation I'm thinking of, people also emphasize that error can happen. Error that tends towards reformism can happen and can be worked through in the usual course of religious debate. But there's a general concern, and it's frequently understood as, like if you go on YouTube and search for Tadeso thing, it's often expressed in terms of style, like the wrong worship style, modern versions of Orthodox hymns, like using the wrong kinds of instrumentation that are seen as sort of slightly monstrous. And at the time I was working in Addis, there was a particular priest named Begasho who had been the focus of widespread insinuation. And a lot of people I spoke to told me they didn't think Begasho was Tadeso at all. Yes, I need to actually follow up on what's happened to him. But so you're quite right. There have been movements that have split off, but there's some debate about what it actually involves. And frequently people, like for regular kind of lay Orthodox Christians in Addis, people will look at whether you talk about Jesus Christ too much. Whether a preacher talks about Jesus, a preacher should talk about Mary, because Mary is the marker of Orthodoxy. She is the Mother of God. You have T-shirts that say, "Without Mary, there is no Christianity." So a preacher who refers to Jesus too much will start to get insinuations of being Tadeso, of failing to refer to the broad Orthodox canon, just referring to the New Testament, which is a very Protestant thing. The Christian islands, so T-shirts have started, Miron Zeleka talks about this. T-shirts have started propping up at Epiphany and other festivals that say Ethiopia is a Christian island. It's taken to be very aggressive, like a highly politicized statement. Many people feel it's driven by the Mabrik Addisam. That's saying Ethiopia is both Orthodoxy is in battle, but also there's no place for Protestantism or Islam within it. And loads of people have noticed the sort of polemical T-shirt aspect is quite recent. I don't know whether that's a reabsorption of European discourses about the Christian island. I can well believe that it might be, but I don't have any evidence.
Sorry, excuse me. So we have a lot of questions. So Elaine next.
No, I actually have just to follow up on this question around the internalization of Western discourses in Ethiopia. Just thinking about your own account of Orthodoxy in Ethiopia and the way in which Orthodoxy is sort of trying to constitute a public and a kind of alternative political authority. And you talked in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned this kind of battle against modernity, and you said that it was a successful battle and so on, which I think was an interesting claim. But I think the way in which Christianity has been practiced in Ethiopia or been lived is one where people have moved between Orthodoxy, Islam, Tsar, indigenous religions, and Protestantism, right? So as a kind of lived, the way religion is lived in Ethiopia is that people are actually moving through all of those things all the time. You can go to the mosque and you can find somebody with a cross on their forehead or something, and so on. So your talk was interesting to me because it really presented a kind of Orthodox Christianity that was fixed, that was nearly equated with the nation state of Ethiopia, which is a kind of discourse of the West about Ethiopia, which I don't think really accords with how religion is actually lived in Ethiopia, which is something that, right? Yeah. And then what does it mean that religion is actually practiced in this kind of much more pluralistic way in terms of the types of claims you're trying to make about the Orthodox Church as a political authority, and why is it at this particular moment attempting to become a certain kind of political authority, right? And then, of course, like Protestantism has been very successful in Ethiopia, particularly in this political moment, where with the new regime, Abiy Ahmed is actually Protestant. Most of his cabinet members and people close to him are Protestant, and so on. So the discourse around Protestantism is actually around modernity. It allows us to live in modernity, but then people are still moving back and forth between going to Protestant churches and going to Orthodox churches, because we still need some of that old-time wisdom and so on, right? So I guess I was curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, thank you. That's incredibly helpful. So the best I can say for the people I've been working with, mainly young university students, they're worried about the fact that, as they imagine it in Wollo, people are moving between Islam and Christianity. They're trying to address that. And at the same time, you mentioned Tsar. Everything that I've been told in Addis is that this is the worst possible time to be a Tsar medium, and that people who were doing Tsar possession practices are really receding or just doing a little bit of sort of divining work, but much less prevalent.
I don't know how you think about that sort of like exorcism that you were talking about without thinking about like Tsar, for instance.
I think of it as sort of the opposite, and maybe this is just like old anthropological theory, but these exorcisms are about getting rid of the spirit, right? These spirits are construed as foreign invaders that you need to get out. So this is a purifying movement, whereas Tsar, in my understanding, has been about developing a relationship with the spirit, understanding that, at least according to members of Tsar movements, so they understand that you can't exercise a Tsar spirit. Like the priests will tell you that you can with holy water and proper treatment, but so in some ways they're the opposite, where Tsar has been, like you suggest, accommodating of difference and playing with difference and moving between all those categories and challenging them. And this is, as I understand it, a counter movement, like an effort to sort of have a much more clearly bounded, institutionalized version of what orthodoxy is. It's troubled by, it's like people, Protestant converts who are intensely studying the Orthodox traditions of their parents. This is something that, this is a movement that's attempting to work against all of that stuff, I think. And whether that's, which may well be to do with absorbing Western or at least sort of internationally sanctioned definitions of what religion is, that you need to have clearer boundaries and things. But the withdrawal of Tsar, the sense of Tsar being much harder to find than it was, is something apparently that's regional beyond Ethiopia, happening in Sudan as well. Does that make sense, or are you?
I think that needs to be theorized more rather than taking Orthodox Christian discourses at face value, which it seems to me that you were doing a little bit. Like, what is it about this particular moment that is making people articulate orthodoxy in a particular kind of way? Which is different from how orthodoxy or religion has been lived previously. So I feel like there needs to be some theorization in your work about that.
And the way I've tried to theorize it in Zege has been a general push to produce institutionally recognizable forms of religion that relate to the government, that relate to claims made on the government to try and get some of the land and some of the buildings that the churches used to own back.
So,
that
for
you've
instance,
seen.
What was interesting to me about your claim that heathens, I'm not sure what term you used, that those included socialists. I mean, I've spent a few hours at Debre Libanos being lectured by a priest about the goodness of the Derg regime, the goodness of the socialist regime. So I think those boundaries that you're setting up need to be questioned a little bit, and when are they, employed, and who's employing them, that kind of thing. Right. Anyway.
Well,
that's great. Thank you.
And these might come back, but so the gentleman at the back here.
So thanks, fascinating stuff, and I should say, admit I'm way out of my skis here, but two questions about the fasting. One, can you just give us a little sense of what exactly that entails? Is it the standard, like what I think of as standard Orthodox meat, dairy, oil, wine kind of thing? And then secondarily, the people you talk to, if I understood correctly, have an idea that that fasting predisposes one to certain particularly attentive mental states. I wonder how deterministic, if you have a sense of how deterministic they think that is. Because like Protestants fast, Muslims fast. Does it do something for them too, I guess?
Yeah. So the minimum of fasting is not consuming any animal products. Generally not having sexual activity as well. But the most public one that everyone recognizes is like not eating meat, not having dairy and stuff. The timing, for most people that'll be Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent. And then there are, if you're going to church, you need to abstain from all food and water until church is finished, or if you plan to go near it. But and there's a very lively debate about what fasting ought to involve for the laity. For the clergy, it's about 256 days that they're supposed to follow. But there's great debate about what the correct minimal is, whether people ought to be doing more fasting, particularly on Holy Week and Easter Saturday, which has been a big focus of attempts to sort of deepen fasting practice along with deepening celibacy and other activities. So yeah, the sort of normative understanding of fasting as weakening flesh, it's not the only way of reading fasting, and I've talked about it in my book. Part of the thing with fasting is it's not immediately attached to a set of discourses. Like, you don't have to attach a meaning to it. There's broad variety, but the weakening of the flesh and the focus is the most consistent theme I've found, both from reading other works and other ethnographic works, but particularly in Addis. In terms of thinking about, most Orthodox Christians that I know recognize that Muslims fast, and so recognize Islam as at least a sort of commensurate or commensurable religion with Orthodoxy, because fasting is practiced. But it's not practiced at the same time. I haven't spoken with Orthodox Christians about what might be the qualitative differences with Muslim fasting. So I think they have an answer for that. But there's less of an awareness that Protestants would practice fasting. Certainly, it's like it's seen as not structured, not according to canonical laws that have laid out exactly when you're supposed to do it. And part of it is following the canon, following the doctrine of correct practice as it is set out, and deferring to that.
And intention is essential to it, or like, if I fasted, would it also, it would weaken my flesh, would it therefore predispose me to this kind of a...
Depends who you talk to. So the people who are engaged in this kind of activist work will say, like, if you're fasting but you're thinking sinful thoughts, then you're not really fasting. Working in Zogea with people who aren't like actively in that tradition, if you're fasting, you're doing it. So, but the people who are interested in correctness say there's more to it, and that intention does matter.
Yes.
I was going to ask if there's a resurgence in this orthodoxy. Does it play out also in the way they address social problems? That is, compassion and love for other tribes, for other sorts of people, for HIV/AIDS, for poverty. Is there any aspect of this resurgence that plays out in the social interactions of the Orthodox?
Yeah, I'm profoundly ethically driven. I know like, a constant theme of preaching in people's discourses is almsgiving, helping the poor. There are, I think, significant debates about the nature of almsgiving and the nature of charitable work. The church has set up a development wing called DCAP that was doing some HIV support work, but was controversial because a lot of the work it was doing was lending support to monasteries to do, and monasteries do pastoral work and they work with the communities, but it was criticized for not being direct kind of recognisable development projects in the sense of the international development scheme. So yes, this revival is profoundly ethically driven and profoundly about your social behaviour towards others. And ethics in the media, particularly ethics in the way you comport yourself in discourse, is something that people have really emphasised. But whether with and tolerance for other people, I think is something that people would generally accept. But the problem is with these sort of purifying efforts, particularly worries about reformism, it turns it into conflict quite quickly. And I'm trying to argue that that's something that Orthodox Christians are really worried about. It's not necessarily starting from my critique, it's something that people raise consistently. It's like with this public purification work, you're risking kind of unethical things emerging.
So this clash that you report between the reformists and the Orthodox is still a big part of the society. There's not much compassion for the reformists.
I'm not sure how to answer that. I think there are general principles of human Christian compassion that are pretty wide-going, but reformism as a thing is something that needs to be got rid of. But having political arguments or religious enemies doesn't necessarily translate to me into a lack of compassion. I'm not sure those two things always line up.
I mean, the entire regime is now Protestant, so they're living in what is still like a predominantly 40-something% Orthodox country. So there's obviously some way in which these things are being brought together.
Yeah.
Right. It's not just a discourse of, we dislike these people.
Yeah.
I mean, the Prime Minister is the most popular Prime Minister, I don't know, ever. So there's something else happening here, is what I'm trying to suggest.
Yeah, absolutely. And I haven't done any of this work since
Right.
Dr. Abiy came
Right.
into power, but from what I've seen,
Right.
spending a bit of time in Addis, you're right, there's huge optimism
And his discourse is a Protestant discourse of love and Redeemer and all of that stuff, right? And it resonates with people who are Orthodox. So anyway, this is why I think these leakages of the boundaries need to be theorized a bit more.
Sure.
Right. Sorry.
So you've set up this essentially triangular discussion, which definitely does have boundary linkages between the Orthodox, the Protestants, and the secularists or the reformers. While they're a very small population, where do you see Catholicism fitting into this, particularly given their historically antagonistic role as the kind of rivals for attention and affect with the Orthodox?
So speaking to people in the Patriarch's office and theologians involved with the Orthodox Museum, people have told me that the old divide with Catholicism over Christology and over so-called metaphysitism, people have told me they don't think that distinction is relevant anymore. There's been pretty much complete convergence, and that disagreements with the Catholic Church are more to do with sort of, I guess, jurisdiction and tradition, like historical reasons, but not foundational kind of theological distinctions. For the people I've been speaking to, like, Catholicism isn't really widespread enough to, like, I haven't heard people describe it in threatening terms. There's a lot of discourse about stealing sheep, particularly with reference to Protestant conversion, that's just been much more prevalent. So I'm not aware of any particular discourse about Catholicism as a threat or a competitor at the moment.
Yes, the gentleman here, did you have a question? Okay.
Answer the question about the exorcism or the tutor. If I translate that to Nigeria, it was very born again. It's a very Pentecostal image. And so, forgive my ignorance, in Ethiopia, Protestants come up a lot, but I don't really know which Protestants. And so I was wondering if, in some sense, obviously, if there's this sense of anxiety through which this movement needs to rejuvenate around attention, then there's something else that's generating that anxiety. On the one hand, you might be a secular God, on the other hand, it seems to be a Protestant God. So you're in this agonistic competition for adherence in some sense, if I understand correctly. But do they then, are they borrowing forms from Pentecostalism? So that's an enormously familiar thing. Turning it into a spectacle, putting it onto television, raising money out of it, Pentecostal church, goes more cerebral through to charismatic faith healing. The charismatic Catholic revivals had to take on elements of this in order to counter it specifically. So I was wondering about that, and in relationship to that, I was wondering about the Pentecostals oftentimes operated in West Africa through identifying enemies vis-a-vis which they were offered protection or would defeat. So that would be Catholics, it would certainly be animist religions, also Muslims. So in this sense of the agonistic thing that Ernie was talking about, where the people you're speaking to seem to identify, to refuse pluralism and identify an enemy in some sense, that also seems very Pentecostal in the context of a place like Nigeria. Is any of that relevant? Do you have a presence there? Are these forms circulating within between these different groups?
I think it's very relevant. Like, people have noticed that the work Memoragoma does looks sort of Pentecostal in a lot of ways. His ways of performatively being not Pentecostal are having gigantic icons all across the back of the stage. Saint Arsema and Saint Michael, and like all these very unequivocally Orthodox bits. But I think it's part of the reason people worry about him and accuse him of things. And I think that part of the research process was to give a talk on the work I was doing to a group of sort of Orthodox students and other interested people, and just see what they thought of it, about religion and media. Kind of asking whether people were worried about mediatization, something that might be threatening to orthodoxy. And there's a very open question about whether circulating and showing and videoing things is like a Protestantizing or a reforming technology. I think there's a general tendency to be concerned about this, but to conclude that it's not if you're using it right. But people are, I think, trying to work out what are the limits of that circulation. What are the points at which that circulation begins to become a canonical threat? And people, like during the talk, people referred to me, okay, there are different degrees of changeability between your canon, your doctrine, and your dogma. And there are parts that you can adopt in, like any technique that's supporting evangelism and supporting the Christian imperative of witnessing. It is great. But people are aware of that anything that looks like making into media has become a sort of Protestant signifier. So I think there are ways of re-signifying it as Orthodox by using the saints, by focusing on the wider canonical texts, by these sorts of methods that show, and by using traditional instrumentation and by opposing certain, the modern instruments as the things that will convert it from innocuous media into something more threatening. So yeah, I think it's something people are working through. What turns something into a Protestantizing kind of medium. But then these the Mabra Kiddusan are using modern education. They're not purely like. I guess going back to Lenny's question, they're not completely purifying. They are working, especially with secular schooling. I noticed a lot of interest in studying psychology, which I really want to follow up on, because I don't know why that was particularly interesting to people I met, whether that was coincidence or what. But there are accommodations, but there are attempts to there are certain traditionalist markers that mark particularly Mabra Kiddusan discourses. I haven't had time to talk about. There's a new theological college that was founded under Haile Selassie that is much more open to using methods that are derived from Euro-American theological ceremonies and using modern grammar and not modern grammar, sorry, using the sort of modes of grammatical and philological study derived from theological traditions in Europe and America. And it's often those people have relationships with the Mahabra Gurdasam, and they're sometimes seen as being too New Testament-y and too biblical scholarship and not looking at the Ethiopian canon. But in fact, they are working on patristics and stuff as well. So there are people moving between different modes of education. So that there are various accommodations going on, and a lot of these disputes are happening within communities of people with a shared interest.
Okay, yes, gentlemen.
So, thank you very much. May I steer you back towards your comments, what you said in one of your interviews said about the differences between Ethiopian Orthodox liturgical music and some forms of Protestant music. So, if I recall what you said, one of your interviews talked about how some forms of Protestant music flatten, as opposed to the use of the harp and some other instruments in the Orthodox, in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So, in essence, what I'm asking is really a comment, maybe a question. My sense is that whether it's in the Slavonic tradition of the Orthodox Church, the instruments are not allowed at all. It's just singing. In the Greek Orthodox Church in America, the organ is used, as opposed to the Orthodox Church in Greece. I was in an Orthodox Church in Nigeria, speaking of Nigeria, and a drum was used during the Lord's Prayer. So I wonder if, perhaps there's a comment, a question, if you could speak more to how such instruments like the harp are used within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and how that may further your argument, your overall argument about attention. Because it seems to me your interview was saying at that instant there's something about some forms of Protestant worship that flattens, that distracts rather than focus attention. I wonder if there's something there within your interview's comments about how our Orthodox music, you didn't use the word, maybe he didn't use the word heightens, but there seems to be something done within the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition of music that is not done in some forms of Protestant music. So maybe that's helpful or not, but I wonder if I could just steer you to talk more about perhaps what the instruments within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church are doing. It's not the case.
So, this is not an area on which I'm hugely knowledgeable, but the part I am aware of, and in discussions with this guy and others, it's particularly the association with King David and St. Yared, and there's a particular kind of harp called the begener, which is very big, very low notes, can only be played very slowly. That's for penitential music especially, and for Lent, whereas there are smaller harps for use at other times. But the part that I can speak to is the association with David and with St. Yared speaks to drawing on the broader canon, which is understood to be distinctively Ethiopian, distinctly, it's this idea that the Mahabra Gurdasam portrays of keeping the church fathers alive, keeping the people who have handed down to us these techniques, maintaining that is understood to be particularly important. And then he talked about the specific moods that it was supposed to induce in you. But it's that historical relationship to certain people who are crucial to the tradition. That I think that was what he was driving at. But
If you even go back to the story of Yahweh, it's the original story of attention and affect. The king gets so into the music that he forgets himself and he stabs Yahweh in the foot. He's so entranced by the music. I mean, really, you can't be that if you're going for affect.
thank you. Awesome.
Yeah, Roger.
Like, some of it obviously, but I want to ask about the argument about several regimes of attention, and then So historically this isn't the case. There's always been several regimes of attention, right, competing, right, symbolic, like the bridge. What is it specifically about secular notions of attention that make different claims to the Orthodox Church?
I'm thinking back to being shown around the Marburg Center School by the Secretary General and the headmaster of the school showing me, and they had beginners and other kind of harps, but emphasizing to people like they teach getters, but they use grammatical methods. It's not using. I think it is a certain utilitarianism. If you're concentrating it so you can, gain a technological understanding, you can learn to understand this knowledge and have it. So by understanding the grammatical principles of the language, you can then know the language rather than having to recite it, to memorize it, to have it in your body. So even if you go blind, you'll be able to continue to recite the scripture. That sense that your bodily practice is like. It is not just necessary to apply knowledge, but it is through embodying it. It is through living this tradition, practicing and repeating this tradition that you will prepare yourself. And I think it's fair to say, think about artists as well. Like the claim of secular knowledge is that you can know stuff, and that you could even create knowledge. And I think it's fair to say the claim of the church is that the church tradition is that knowledge comes from God, and you are learning to become a vessel for divine creativity. I believe that's an important distinction that people are leaning on.
Can I just follow up on that? There was a question earlier from Brian about what kind of Protestants we're talking about, and yeah, I mean Pentecostals and Lutherans are two very different kinds of Protestants. But what about the secular? I mean, what kinds of registers of secularity are at work here? To what extent are they tied to the Derg and to certain understandings or traditions of Marxist thought? To what extent are they understood as we see in work in Egypt by Sabra Mahmoud and others around secularity and modernity as a kind of a very kind of specific Western problematic and trouble. To what extent is it tied to that? I mean, presumably there must be several different versions of both secularity and secularism in play, and I wonder if you can kind of tease out some of those more. I mean, some of them, this kind of instrumentalism that you're talking about, or the idea of knowledge or the mastery of knowledge, calculation. Makes me think of Weber, and what is disenchantment? Well, it's about thinking that you might not know everything, but you start to think that everything is knowable, right? You don't know how the streetcar moves, but you're sure that someone does. So that the kind of evacuation of wonder, right, from the world. So I just would be interested to hear.
Yeah, so the technical aspects have been discussed like way before the day. They go back into Haile Selassie and maybe even Menelik, and discussions of both setting up schools but setting up an administrative bureaucracy. Then there's the constitutional aspect, like the explicit constitutional bracketing of religion outside of governmental work, which involves trying to, like the government authorizing certain categories of the religious, like the Orthodox Church, like the Al-Habash school of Islam, as being acceptable within a regime in which the work of government itself is supposed to be evacuated of that. So there's that technical aspect, and then there's that sort of legal political. This is not how the government is structured, it will not be run along those principles. But for the people I was talking to, when they focused back on secularism, they were usually explaining to me why Protestantism was secular. It was the things in Protestantism that looked to be non-religious or looked to be like violating certain principles of like what I take to be an ascetic understanding of what it is to be religious. And this talk is trying to sort of work through what people meant by telling me that what that Protestant secular overlap is understood to be.
Okay. Well, one final word.
Someone mentioned this abused expression, Ethiopia is not the last, it's the last bastion. I thought Genesis chapter 2, verse 13 in the Bible meant it's the first, because that's the first nation mentioned in the Bible. And Queen Sheba is a Hollywood name. Her name was Queen Makeda of the Candace dynasty. And I myself, because it's part of we have to do Orthodox, you fast 15 days for St. Mary. And you never say the Lord's Prayer without following it with the St. Mary's Prayer. Never. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, that's a good way to end, I think. So, Tom, thank you very much for the talk, and thank you all.